In the mid-19th century, a network of tunnels, trails, and safe houses would help over 100,000 slaves escape the South to free northern states and Canada. Now, this network would be called the Underground Railroad. Many of you have probably heard of it. But over a century earlier, a similar network led south to Florida, and their final destination would be here at Fort Mose. So Fort Mose is located about 2 miles north of what is now the city of St. Augustine, and it is significant for a few reasons. For starters, it directly contributed to Spain's defense network of St. Augustine. And the second is this would be the first free black settlement in what is now the United States. Now, in 1689, the Spanish authorities in Florida began to grant asylum to escaped slaves from the southern English colonies. In return, bugs are pretty bad in Florida. In return, the escaped slaves would have to agree to convert to Catholicism, and all the able-bodied members would sign a 4-year contract to serve in Spain's militia, which would help defend the city of St. Augustine. Now we're going to head inside and get out of the scorching heat and check out the visitor center here. They got some pretty cool things inside, and then after that, we're going to go ahead and check out where Fort Mose once stood and where a very bloody battle would take place between the Spanish and English. So we're in the lobby now, but before we go any further, we have got to stop and check these out. I'm a sucker for old weapons and munitions. So this one here is a 3-pound shot, and this 9-pound round is from my naval cannon. I can fire up to several miles. And a few others here. Pretty cool. You don't realize how many different munitions they have. Now, Fort Mose was originally discovered in 1738, and it would start out with about 100 inhabitants. So right here, we're just touching on, I believe, the first group that would arrive here, and I believe it was in the 1680s, 1687, but don't hold me to that. But I believe a group of 8 arrived from the English colony of South Carolina, and this is just showing the distance that they were willing to travel to escape the harsh realities of slavery. Now this looks pretty cool. This is some of the things that were recovered here on numerous archaeological digs. There's some nails, some tacks. Over here, some few personal belongings, some smoke pipes, and they have some descriptions of what you're actually looking at. If you're like me, half the time you don't really know. And this looks like some pieces of clothing. Really cool. Now, Fort Mose would be the first line of defense for St. Augustine, and it didn't take long for them to experience combat. Native American invaders, and in 1740, the British would launch an attack on Fort Mose, and the militia here would play a critical part. This is pretty cool. I got some musket balls and looks like some gun flints. Now, gun flints were a stone that would help create a spark and ignite the powder. And they have an example where I can show you here in just one sec. Now here is a flintlock pistol. And if you can see, the flint would go right in between that gap. And when the trigger was pulled, that hammer would come forward and there would be black powder in this pan. And it would ignite the black powder and fire the projectile. Really cool. Like I said, and I love this time period and the weaponry. Now you see this clip here. That's so you can clip it onto your belt or like a chest harness. And here's another cannonball. Really cool. The leader of Fort Mose would be a man named Francisco Menendez. And he was originally born in West Africa and sold into English slavery. And he would come here and become the leader of the militia and prove his loyalty in several engagements in this area. Now, another note on Francisco Menendez would be that he would be captured by the English and sold back into slavery. But he would escape once again and make his way back to Fort Mose in 1759. Now, during this time, many slaves would be taken from West Africa and brought over to the English colonies. So when they gathered at Fort Mose, it made a very diverse community. Now, the museum has several interactive exhibits, and what you do is you stand on these, and audio from these speakers tells you a story of the piece you're looking at. And this one here is touching on the several languages that were spoken at Fort Mose. Like we touched on, it was very diverse. But obviously we'd have English and Spanish, and also several Native American languages were spoken here. Not only did they aid the escaped slaves to freedom, some of them also resided here. Now, I don't know if you can see this picture, but this is a gun emplacement that would be at Fort Mose. You see the earthworks, and on top, they would often plant cactus or other spiny plants to try and deter invaders from scaling the walls. Now, here we have what would be the second Fort Mose. The first one was destroyed in 1740 during the Battle of Bloody Mose, which we're going to touch on when we head outside. But this one would be much larger and would be surrounded by a moat, and this side would be left undefended because that would be the river. But again, a prickly defense, and they would line the top of the walls with cactus and other thorny plants in this area. So definitely wouldn't want to scale those. Now, this fort would be built in 1752, 12 years after the first fort was destroyed in a battle. And just some other renderings of the fort, what it would look like. And obviously they had a lot of their farmland outside of the fort, and their shelters, churches, watchtowers, storehouses in the fort. Now, Spain was obviously a Catholic nation, so in order to live here, in exchange for your freedom, you had to convert to Catholicism. Now, these are just some pieces that they found here, and it looks like they were rosary beads. And just showing you where these pieces would be found. And here's some medallions that had a religious significance. Now, something I really like about this museum is they get personal. They cover several stories of inhabitants that actually lived here and where they were from and what they did while they resided at Fort Mose. I think that's really cool, and it helps kind of shape the image of what life was really like here.
My name is Pedro Grajales. I'm a Congo man born in West Central Africa. English slavers took me to Carolina, but I escaped. I'm a sergeant in the Spanish militia and live at Fort Mose. Fighting in the militia is dangerous, but I'll gladly fight against the English because they took me from my homeland. My wife, Maria, is a slave in St Augustine. Because she is a slave, our 6 children are slaves too. I would rather live with my family, but I go to St Augustine often and visit them.
Now, they got a massive timeline of this whole area, starting at 1510 with the discovery of Florida by Juan Ponce de Leon. And you can see the discovery of Fort Caroline, which we covered in my first video. But something I wanted to point out was Fort Mose was established in 1738. Now, obviously word spread quick, and in 1739, a group of slaves in South Carolina would lead a revolt. Now, that revolt would eventually be put down, but you can see the impact that Fort Mose had on the slave population in the English colonies. So in 1763, the British would sign the Treaty of Paris, which would end the 7 Years' War, and England would gain control of Florida. Now, upon hearing this, the inhabitants of Fort Mose and the Spanish colonists in St Augustine would flee to Cuba to escape the British rule. Now, many of the inhabitants of Fort Mose would wind up in Matanzas, Cuba, not to be confused with the Matanzas Inlet, or Fort Matanzas in Florida, but this is showing the plots of land that they would receive. That's really cool. So we're all finished in the Museum and Visitor Center, which is awesome. Learned a lot. And now we're going to head out and see the site of where the second fort was built in 1752. Unfortunately, where the first fort was built is completely underwater. But while we're walking out there, we're going to touch on the bloody battle that took place here between the English and Spanish. Now they are trying to expand the facility here, and they're working towards building a replica of the first fort that was built here in 1738. Now this looks super cool. As you can see, the first fort was much smaller than the second, but if you're seeing this, go to the website, post it, and donate so we can keep learning from history. So in 1740, the British, under the command of Governor James Oglethorpe of Georgia, would march south and lay a 39-day siege to St. Augustine. Now, before he arrived, the Spanish and the inhabitants of Fort Mose would retreat back to the city of St. Augustine and take refuge in the Castillo de San Marcos. Now, since Fort Mose was abandoned, the British were able to capture it, and they set up a defensive position, which was now just north of the city of St. Augustine. Now, during the siege, about 300 Spanish regulars, some Native American auxiliaries, and the Fort Mose militia would launch an assault about 4 a.m. and catch the British completely by surprise. Now, the battle would rage for several hours, and after, 75 British would lay dead, including their commander, Colonel John Palmer. Now, the Spanish would retake Fort Mose, but unfortunately, it was destroyed during the battle, and they wouldn't rebuild the second one until 12 years later. But this battle here helped the Spanish break the British siege of St. Augustine, and the rest of the British forces would retreat back to Georgia. So we are reaching the end of this 700-foot boardwalk through the marshlands, and this clump of trees right here would be the location of the second fort that was built in 1752. Now they know this because they compared maps from today and Spanish maps from the 1740s and 50s, and they were able to pinpoint the location. The park ranger inside also said that they found several artifacts there and raises and depressions in the terrain, which would indicate where a wall would be or a moat. And just to give you a reference as to where we are, that clump of trees is straight ahead there. Now, the first fort would be somewhere in this general direction. And as we stated earlier, unfortunately, that site is underwater. But you can see the apartments in the background. St. Augustine is about 1.5 miles south of this location. So if you've managed to watch this whole video and make it to the end, I hope you learned something. I know I did. I just think it's so awesome that the very first underground railroad went south to Florida. You often don't really hear about that part. But yeah, I learned a lot, and this is definitely a place I'm going to come back to. So if you're ever in the area, pay Fort Mose a visit, and don't forget to donate so we can keep learning from our history. Come on, people, we have to do better than this. We need to learn from our history. This parking lot should be filled. We can do better.